Hello, I'm Carol Fleck, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled The Power of Positive Reinforcement, Why Rewards Trump Punishment for Students with ADHD. Children with ADHD sometimes require a different behavioral approach to learning and motivation. We know that kids with ADHD are more sensitive to rewards and punishment than their neurotypical peers, and we know that they often respond best to consistent positive reinforcement. In today's webinar, parents and teachers will learn how to approach behavior modification in students with ADHD. This includes how to respond when a child's task persistence drops, how to use positive reinforcement to help kids learn new skills, and when to reward effort when homework gets challenging. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Gail Tripp. Dr. Tripp is a clinical psychologist and professor at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology Graduate University in Japan. She focuses on the learning and motivational processing of children with ADHD and implications for treatment. In a recent study, she examined predictors of academic achievement in children with ADHD. Before I hand over the microphone to Dr. Tripp, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned in to the live webinar may submit questions for the expert at any time by navigating to the text box under the video player. To download the slides, click on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you're interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you'll receive about an hour after the live broadcast. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search Podcast 420 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the Certificate of Attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude magazine. In the latest fall issue, we're featuring our special Success at School section. You'll learn how to help your students overcome homework challenges, how to win over a new teacher, how to bully-proof your kids, and for adults, how to identify ADHD symptoms after age 50, and so much more. Subscribe to ADDitude magazine for your family or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Equizon Pro. Equizon Pro is a clinically proven nutritional medical food designed to help improve focus, attention, academic performance, and balanced mood for those with ADHD. Clinical studies have shown Equizon Pro can improve ADHD symptoms in as little as 12 weeks. Now is the perfect time to start supporting your child's mind and get them ready for back to school. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Gail Tripp. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this discussion.
Carol, thank you very, very much, and also to the entire ADDitude team. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to everyone today. Just first up, I don't have any disclosures, so I think we'll move on. So I wanted to give the listeners an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the targets for change that Carol mentioned. I want to talk to you about functional analysis, which is where we really look at the behaviours that we are wanting to change or modify, and then the antecedents and the consequences of those behaviours, particularly positive reinforcement, so that we can see how to move forward for greater success for children and young people with ADHD. I'm going to give you some general recommendations about the use of reinforcement, which apply across the board, and also some cautions regarding the use of punishment. I then am going to talk, as Carol mentioned, about altered sensitivity to reinforcement in those with ADHD and how important it is to keep this in mind when we're looking at behavioural modification. And then we're going to bring it all together and look at those original targets for change and see how we can apply the things that I talk about today. So I'm not going to go back through those targets for change because Carol actually went through those, but I'd like you to keep these in mind because I'm going to utilise them to talk about how we can change behaviour at the front end through antecedents, and how we can change it through modifying the consequences of those behaviours. So just beginning with this notion of a functional analysis, the reason I want to introduce this to you is really so that going forward from today's webinar, you can easily apply the things that we've talked about. And for me, doing a functional analysis is beneficial because it helps us to define the target behaviour. What is it that we're wanting to change? And also to understand what the function of that behaviour is, because that often helps us to be better equipped to make change. To identify the circumstances under which the behaviours occur. In other words, is this a behaviour that always occurs, or does it occur in certain situations? And how does that situation set the young person up for success, or perhaps not such a successful interaction or outcome? I want to clarify the consequences or the outcome of a behaviour, because we know that this is what both maintains a behaviour and can increase or decrease a behaviour. And I think a functional analysis really helps us to individualize behaviour management plans. And I just wanted to remind you that not everything is always as it seems. When we first look at a behaviour or a situation, we may not see exactly what the functions of a child's behaviour are. And so, again, this is why looking a little deeper is helpful. This slide is just a very simple graphic of a functional analysis where we can focus in on the behaviour that we want to modify or change, but the antecedents are really what set the scene for an action or a behaviour to occur, and then the consequences influence the likelihood that behaviour will be repeated. And essentially, outcomes that are reinforcing will increase the likelihood that the behaviour will be repeated, and outcomes that are less pleasant or not enjoyable to the individual will reduce the likelihood that that behaviour will be decreased. And as I said, we can intervene, if you like, at both the antecedent side and also at the consequences. So again, we talked about, this is going back to the target behaviours again, and I've just gone through and sort of said, well, what might be the targets of interest here? And in that first one, you know, how to respond when a child's task persistence drops away and she begins to respond impulsively or becomes emotional. So there are a number of things that we could be looking at here. We could look at the task persistence. That could be the thing that we want to change. It might be the impulsive response that we want to change, or it could be the emotional reactivity. It might be all three, but what we need to do is look at what our target is going to be. The same in learning a new behaviour. What is the behaviour that we want to be targeting? Looking at weighting. What do we mean by weighting behaviour, and thinking about both what the young person is doing and what we would like them to be doing. Looking at transitions, you know, are we transitioning from a known to an unknown situation? Are we looking at alternative behaviours that we want the young person to engage in? So thinking about what they're currently doing or how they're currently behaving, and how we would or how we think it would be better for them to behave are the things we're looking at here. And in that last one, looking at homework, are we looking at the actual homework behaviour? Is it the task persistence that we're looking at? And I've already mentioned that behaviour is influenced both by the consequences of an individual's actions, but also, as I've said, by the situation in which those behaviours are occurring. So, as I say, I do think we need to look at both. And when we talk about antecedents, we're really talking about the context in which a behaviour occurs, because this can influence the nature or occurrence of that behaviour. And as I say, we can use antecedents to encourage or support more appropriate behaviour. Now, none of the examples of antecedent strategies that I've just put up here on the slides are going to be new to you, but I'm just really putting them in the context of being antecedent strategies. So, clear communication, establishing and communicating clear rules or expectations as a parent or a teacher, giving clear directions. Both of those things can actually set the child up for success. Planning ahead, planning for appropriate and inappropriate behaviour. Thinking through these things ahead of time can mean that when the child is behaving appropriately, you're ready and able to encourage and reinforce that behaviour. If inappropriate behaviour is occurring, you're ready, you know how you're going to respond. Next one is establishing an environment that supports desired behaviours. And an example of this would be reducing distractions. If you reduce the distraction, the child may be more able to attend, may be more able to get on with their homework and things like that. And then the last example there is just using prompts or cues to guide behaviour. So those are the kind of antecedent strategies that we're thinking about. And I've just put them in here again just for your information in terms of what might you target with those behaviours that Carol first mentioned. Planning ahead, setting up an environment for success, communicating clearly, providing prompts to a child, communication environment and prompts may be things that you attend to. And essentially through there, most of it is coming down to clear communication and prompts and setting up an environment which makes it more likely for a child to be able to be successful. Because if you can set the scene for them to be successful, then you can actually use the reinforcement to strengthen and maintain that appropriate behaviour. In terms of consequences, we know that behaviours that are followed by pleasant outcomes or the avoidance of unpleasant outcomes are actually more likely to be repeated. And so I'm using some terminology here because as a parent or as a teacher, when you are reading books or reading research literature, these will probably be the terms that you come across. So when we talk about a positive reinforcer, we're talking about an outcome that follows a behaviour and increases the likelihood that that behaviour will be repeated. So we define a positive reinforcer as something that increases the likelihood that a behaviour will be repeated. When we talk about a negative reinforcer, we're not talking about punishment, but we're talking about the removal of a stimulus or an event that is typically aversive, and that is followed by an increase in the behaviour that results in the removal of that stimulus. An example would be, an example of negative reinforcement would be if as an adult you were driving and the sun was in your eyes and you put your sunglasses on, and putting the sunglasses on reduces the glare that you have in your eye, then putting on your sunglasses is likely to be negatively reinforced. You're likely to repeat that putting on of the sunglasses the next time you have sun in your eyes because it removed something that was unpleasant or aversive. So we can talk about using positive reinforcement. We can talk about using a negative reinforcer. In both cases, the behaviour becomes more likely to be repeated. And then behaviours that are followed by unpleasant outcomes or the removal of pleasant outcomes are less likely to be repeated. Now, a positive punishment is when a behaviour is followed by an outcome which the individual finds as unpleasant, and the frequency of the behaviour that occurred before that outcome would decline. And then when we talk about negative punishment, we're talking about the removal of an outcome following a behaviour and the frequency of that behaviour declines. And an example of that might be if your child was misbehaving and you removed attention from their behaviour and the behaviour declined, that would be an example of negative punishment. an example of positive punishment might be if you got a speeding ticket. If you are speeding and you get caught and you get a speeding ticket, you are less likely, well, in theory anyway, less likely to speed in future because that the speeding cost you something. It was followed by an unpleasant consequence. And this graphic here is just to remind you that anything that is called positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement is going to increase the likelihood that a behaviour reoccurs. A behaviour that is followed by a positive punishment or a negative punishment is likely to decrease that behaviour. And if you're wondering if we're talking about what the positive and the negative refers to, when we're talking about positive reinforcement or positive punishment, we're talking about adding something to the situation. When we talk about negative reinforcement or negative punishment, we're talking about taking something away. And I don't want to labour that, but that's just a graphic if you're ever trying to work out these different options. Now, I wanted to just mention some factors that influence the effectiveness of punishment. And this is with children and young people with ADHD and for neurotypical children and adolescents. So the amount of reinforcement can influence its effectiveness, but I think particularly important is the salience of a reinforcer. Is it something that the child finds reinforcing or desirable? And if actually you are using something that you think is a reinforcer and the child's behaviour isn't changing, then it may be that they actually don't find that reinforcing. So do think about what is reinforcing for the children that you're living with or that you're teaching. Schedules of reinforcement can also be important. We know that behaviour or new behaviour, new knowledge tends to be learned more quickly when reinforcement is continuous. In other words, each time the behaviour occurs, it's reinforced. But we also know that behaviour is more persistent if it is learned under partial or non-continuous reinforcement, so that not every experience or not every occurrence of a behaviour is reinforced. That becomes important if children are going to be going into a situation where there are likely to be lower levels of reinforcement available and you want their behaviour to persist. And also important to think about are the presence of competing reinforcers. When we set up behavioural management programs, for example, we often think that the reinforcers that we are delivering are the only reinforcers that are available to a child in their environment, which is not actually true. You know, if we think about a classroom situation, yes, a child is going to be reinforced for being on task and getting on with their work, but that's perhaps not the only thing that's possibly reinforcing for them. Chatting to their neighbour may be very reinforcing. Looking out the window at something interesting that is happening can be also very reinforcing. So when we're establishing, behavioural management strategies, we need to be aware not just of what we are bringing to the situation, but also what else is in the environment that could be contributing to a child's behaviour. Choosing reinforcers, as I've already mentioned, it's important that the reinforcer that you're using is going to be meaningful to the child. So what is reinforcing to a given child? And not all children are reinforced or find the same things reinforcing. I think particularly important, though, is the next sort of set of three. The ease of access. If you're going to be using a reinforcer, it needs to be something that's easily accessible for you, because I've already talked about the importance of, making reinforcement contingent upon a behaviour. The ease of delivery. You don't want to be using reinforcers that are hard to deliver. And importantly, you want to be using reinforcers that are sustainable, things that you can continue to use. It's one of the reasons why we try to use a lot of social reinforcers, because a high five or a smile or a good job, a pat on the back, these are easy to access, they're easy to deliver, and they're sustainable. So that's what I mean there. There's some research looking at whether or not we should try using different reinforcers for different behaviours that we're trying to increase the frequency of. It's something I might come back to when we have a little bit more data on that. I've mentioned the importance of social reinforcers because social reinforcement is very powerful. All of us like to be acknowledged. We like to be appreciated, and our children are no different. They really like to have their efforts acknowledged. And so oftentimes when we talk about reinforcement, we're really talking about noticing and acknowledging an individual's behaviour. And the last one on the list here, called the PREMAC principle, this is just the fact that you can use a desired activity, something that a child likes to engage in, you can use that to reinforce less desirable behaviour. And as adults, we perhaps do this all the time. You know, I might be doing some work, like preparing the slides for today's webinar, and I kind of go to myself, if I prepare 2 more slides, then I can go and get a cup of coffee. So I'm actually using the PREMAC principle there. The cup of coffee is something I desire. It's not that I don't want to make the slides, but that's a little bit effortful. So I reinforce my own behaviour by allowing myself the opportunity to have the cup of coffee or to have the 5-minute break, or maybe I want to look up something on the internet. But these are ways in which, as adults, we reinforce our own behaviour all the time, but it's something to think about with children that you are, as I say, you're teaching or parenting. And just to go back to this notion of, you know, what are we talking about when we talk about positive consequences or negative consequences? Again, going back to social rewards, are positive consequences, praise, encouragement. Sometimes we may use material rewards, that something that a child can work towards. It could be money, it could be a small toy. Activity rewards, you know, the opportunity to engage in a preferred activity. And often this, you know, might be that your children want to go outside and play. It may be that they want to go on the trampoline or the swings or something like that. That would be an example of an activity reward. And also the removal of something unpleasant. You know, once you've got something done, you know, you can stop doing that and have an opportunity to do something else. And negative consequences, this can be planned ignoring. We've already talked about how important and valuable social reward is. So sometimes we can take attention away from a behaviour and the frequency of that behaviour will decline. Natural consequences, you know, if you don't put your shoes on and your feet get wet, then you end up with wet feet and perhaps cold feet. That would be an example of a natural consequence. And response cost is when we perhaps take something away. You know, you didn't come home when you were expected to, so you don't get the opportunity to play on your PlayStation or something like that. That would be an example of a response cost where we take away something that the individual likes. I wanted to emphasise some important issues when we use if punishment is being used. Sometimes we might introduce either a positive punisher or a negative punisher, and there isn't an effect. And that may be because there are other competing reinforcers in the child's environment. And if you take the example of maybe a teenager comes home late, breaks curfew, and maybe they get grounded. Okay, that's the punisher. But actually getting to spend an extra hour with their friends is very reinforcing. So there you've got kind of competing reinforcement. There is the loss of the privilege of going out, but you got to spend longer with your friends, and so there you've got competing reinforcement happening. If you're using punishment as a management, you know, to help modify children's behaviour, you're likely to get more variable responding on the part of the child. Initial intensity matters because we have to be very careful in the use of punishment because it's not something that you can just keep upping the intensity of. Delay weakens the effects of punishment just as it weakens the effects of reinforcement. Punishment may actually increase an undesired behaviour, and individuals differ in their sensitivity to punishment. And there are actually, quite apart from the effects on the behaviour that you want to change, there can be unwanted side effects to punishment. Children may become very emotional, and they may develop escape or avoidance behaviours. So that's something to be very mindful of. It may not decrease the behaviour of concern, and as I've said, increasing intensity is typically not an option. It may lead to modelling of the punishment. You will sometimes see children actually engaging in the actions against other children that may have been used to try to modify their behaviour. And the other very subtle but important issue here is if punishment is very effective, then it can encourage us to use it more than is necessary. So it's a possibility that overuse of punishment may result just because of its effectiveness, which is why we strongly encourage you to look at crowding out inappropriate behaviours with more appropriate behaviours. So reinforcing the things you want to see while ignoring the things that that you're unhappy with, as long as those are behaviours that are not going to result in the child harming or hurting themselves. So what do we mean in terms of alternatives to punishment? This is where we can actually reinforce what we call alternative or incompatible behaviours. So actually reinforcing something that's incompatible with the behaviour that you think needs to be decreased. So it allows you to reduce the frequency of an unacceptable behaviour without having to use punishment. And it also allows you to replace unacceptable behaviours with preferred behaviours. So this is where you set out to actually reinforce behaviours that are incompatible or compete with the behaviour that is unacceptable. And here, this is just going back to those 5 potential situations that Carol mentioned before, and I've just gone through, and I'm not going to spend more time on this now, but you'll see that a lot of the suggestions I'm making here about increasing the salience of a reinforcer and increasing its frequency, maybe starting out reinforcing approximations to the behaviour that you want the child to engage in, and we call that shaping. Maybe using response-specific reinforcers for different situations or different behaviours that you want the child to be engaging in. And again, with the homework demands, again, it comes back often to increased salience and frequency. These are not so specific, but we're going to talk about more specific strategies that you can use for children with ADHD very shortly. Now, the very positive news is that children with ADHD, just like neurotypical children, are sensitive to positive reinforcement and to punishment. But there's growing evidence that children with ADHD do differ from their age mates in their sensitivity to both reinforcement and punishment. So we need to adapt the way that we use reinforcement to make it as effective as possible for young people with ADHD. And that's just the point there, that these differences have important implications for the use of reinforcement and punishment with children with ADHD. What I want to, let me just check my slide. Yeah, what I want to do here is just make clear for you what we know from the research literature about how children with ADHD differ in how they process what we would call motivationally significant events, reinforcement and punishment. And to note that awareness of these differences is very important for adults who are dealing with ADHD themselves or who are dealing with ADHD in the children in their care. And I've just marked these as we go through to just highlight what would be antecedent strategies, what would be consequent strategies, and where just actually monitoring behaviour may be important. So we know from the research by our group and others who are doing research with children and young people with ADHD, is that they do show an altered sensitivity to the frequency of reinforcement. So we know when reinforcement is not frequent, that we'll get poorer attention to task, and that the young person's responding is going to be more variable. So if you're in a situation of infrequent reinforcement, those are things to be watching out for. Children with ADHD do show reduced behavioural persistence when reinforcement is reduced or stopped, especially after they've learnt a behaviour under non-continuous reinforcement. Or it shows up, the difference between children with ADHD and neurotypical children shows up more after partial reinforcement. But just to be aware that children with ADHD may show reduced behavioural persistence. In other words, they don't stick with something as long as you think that they might once rates of reinforcement are lower. And this can lead to increased frustration, particularly when an unexpected reinforcer doesn't appear. That's something that we're doing research on at the moment. So what are our recommendations? Well, I think importantly, you need to attend to and address any falling off of performance. So that's the monitoring, and maybe you need to increase the frequency or the salience of a reinforcer. Once a child has learnt a new behaviour, you can look at gradually reducing the frequency or the density of reinforcement, but waiting until the behaviour is well established. Consequence, it's important to remind children of what's required or expected, particularly when reward frequency decreases. That's one of those antecedent techniques. And teaching older children how to actually self-reinforce. I just described an example of self-reinforcement for myself, having a cup of coffee once I've got some work done. Sometimes if I'm having a particularly non-productive day, I might actually write a list of things I need to get done, but I'll add to that list the things I've already done so I can cross them off so I can actually reinforce myself. Children with ADHD have also demonstrated a reduced sensitivity to their prior experience of reward, together with an increased sensitivity to very recent rewards. So they're much more likely to respond to the last thing that reinforced them. So if they've engaged in a behaviour that just reinforced them, they're very likely to engage in that behaviour again, rather than perhaps behaviours that they've been reinforced for in the past. So this can lead to them being more vulnerable to kind of incidental or accidental rewards in their environment. I mentioned before that the rewards that we're setting up are not the only things that's rewarding them in the environment. And because of this increased sensitivity to very recent rewards, they may be engaging in those behaviours, even though there are other activities or other behaviours that you've reinforced them for in the past. They may not be attending to that previous experiences of reinforcement, but just very much in the here and now. And it may mean that behaviour doesn't generalise across settings. So our recommendations here would be to reinforce appropriate behaviour often and immediately, and that may require you to become quite creative with the available reinforcers. It's important to remind children of the rules in a setting, I mean, in a very positive and pleasant way, but don't assume that they always remember what the rules are. I think that's sometimes one of the things that for parents of all children can be frustrating. It's like, well, no, these are the rules that usually apply in this situation, but don't assume that your child with ADHD is always going to remember those rules. And so just think about how you can actually remind them in a discreet way, but one that helps them to behave appropriately. It's important to look at ways to structure the environment to reduce the effects of competing rewards. So making sure that there aren't other things in the environment that are going to reinforce the child and take their attention or their behaviour away from what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And just be, as I say, very mindful of those incidental rewards for competing behaviours that are present in the environment. We know also that children with ADHD don't match their behaviour to the consequences quite as effectively as their neurotypical peers. They also take longer which means they can take longer to adapt to change, changes in your expectation or changes in the contingencies that are operating. And that's particularly true if those changes are not obvious. So sometimes we need to exaggerate the reinforcers for different behaviours that we want them to engage in, or we need to just make sure we tell them what's needed. And so children with ADHD are less able to adapt their behaviour to situational demands, or they may take longer to adapt. So how do we manage this? I think we need to make the rules and contingencies explicit for children with ADHD. That's true for all children, but particularly true for children with ADHD. We need to also let them know when those rules and expectations change. Sometimes we assume, well, we know the rules have changed, so they'll know that the rules have changed, or the expectations and the environment have changed. And an extreme example of this might be the children are out in the playground playing, they're calling out, they're yelling, they're running, they're jumping, all behaviours that are appropriate in the playground. When they come into the classroom, most children very quickly adapt to the new environment and the new contingencies. In other words, what you get rewarded for in the classroom is different to what you're going to get rewarded for in the playground. But for children with ADHD, they don't necessarily adapt as quickly, and you might need to just quietly remind them, okay, we use our inside voice, or we're inside now. Give them a little bit more time and a little bit more flexibility to adapt once those rules and expectations change. And here it's really about the adults' expectations, just knowing it might take them a little bit longer. And it's important to frequently reinforce desired behaviours when children go into a new situation. So if they do what they're meant to do when they come in from the playground to the classroom, if they're quietening down quickly, be there to reinforce them and encourage them to do that behaviour in future. Children with ADHD also show an increased sensitivity to delays in reinforcement. None of us like to wait for a good outcome. We all like to have things sooner rather than later, but that is more true for children with ADHD. The research shows very clearly that they have a stronger preference for immediate reinforcement than their neurotypical peers. They experience difficulty waiting for better outcomes, more difficulty waiting, and they can act to avoid or to minimise delay. This can make them more susceptible to other immediately available rewards in the environment, which means they may appear to be behaving impulsively. They may make poorer or suboptimal choices, and they may engage in activities to distract themselves from the fact that they're waiting. So I'm just letting you know that some of those behaviours that may look like misbehaviour are in fact efforts on the part of the child to deal with delay. And they may show poorer learning of complex tasks if reinforcement is delayed. So how do we deal with that? I think it's very important to reinforce immediately wherever possible. If children are in a situation where they're having to wait, ensure that those delays are within their capacity, because what you might want to do is build up their stamina for waiting, but in order to do that, you need to give them opportunities to be successful waiting so that you can reinforce that waiting behaviour. If rewards are not going to be immediate, if there are competing rewards in the environment, you want to try to reduce their salience. For example, if a child is settling down to do homework, you might want to reduce distractors that could be could be rewards for alternative behaviours in their environment. We need to make sure that non-immediate rewards are salient so that there's something that the child does want to continue to work towards. Can be very helpful if we can teach older children to self-reward during periods of delay. we can link rewards and actions so that when we are rewarding a child for engaging in an appropriate action, sometimes we need to make it clear to them, especially if there's a delay, that why they are receiving the reward. You know, I'm very pleased with what you did before, and you give them a smile or a pat on the back and say, you know, when you did such and such before, it really pleased me. And going back just to the waiting, it's very important to reward efforts to wait. Because many children with ADHD do experience difficulty in waiting, they don't typically get rewarded for their attempts to wait. And we've done some recent research which shows that not only do children with ADHD prefer immediate rewards, even when they attempt to wait, that waiting is harder for them. And importantly, given that we are talking about why we favour positive reinforcement over punishment, we've also been involved in research that shows us that children with ADHD are actually more sensitive to the effects of punishment than their neurotypical peers, and this is a cumulative effect. So we did some research with our group which showed that children with ADHD show increased sensitivity to the cumulative effects of punishment. And what happens is they begin to avoid an action that might lead to punishment, and this actually means they miss opportunities to be rewarded. And we think it likely encourages them to give up on tasks that they experience as difficult. And we don't necessarily think of schoolwork or homework as being punishing, but if it is outside a child's ability level and they're really struggling, they may actually begin to experience it as punishing and start to avoid engaging in behaviours that allow them to avoid the homework which they experience as difficult and therefore punishing. So what are our recommendations? If you're using negative punishment, that is the taking away of something that the child likes, we would say use it cautiously and don't use it over an extended period of time. If at all possible, avoid positive punishment. I think if there is any negative or punishment being used, it's very important to monitor the child's behavioural and emotional responses to that. We would strongly encourage you to redirect and reinforce competing behaviours instead of using punishment. We would suggest that at all possible that you match task demands to the child's ability. That's not to say that we're not encouraging children to step out of their comfort zones or to take on more demanding work, but we are suggesting that you monitor very carefully to make sure that if you're asking them to do something that is difficult for them, that you keep the rates of reinforcement high and you monitor how they're managing. So I was told I had until about 5:45, and I think I've got about a minute or two until then before we open things up for questions. But what I've done, and we don't need to work through this in detail, but for each of those behaviours that Carol mentioned at the beginning, I've gone through and I've identified what might be antecedent strategies that you could use and what might be consequent strategies. And so just maybe working through this first one, how to respond when a child's task persistence drops away and she begins to respond impulsively or become emotional. So the antecedent strategies that you might utilise here are introducing brief breaks so that some work is done and then there's a short break to kind of re-energise and before going back into it, and looking at the work that the child is trying to do or the task that they're trying to do. Is it within their capacity or is it maybe just a little bit too much, in which case it might be necessary to look at reducing the demands. If it's homework that they're doing, check understanding of the work. Do they know what it is they're meant to be doing? Is that the reason why their persistence is dropping off or they're becoming emotional? Matching difficulty level to ability, we've already talked about. Maybe they need a little bit more scaffolding. Maybe you need to demonstrate the task to them again. Maybe they just need a bit more support to learn that task. and maybe teaching self-reward, particularly if it's something that they're going to be a task that they're going to be having to repeat. Maybe it's learning a new skill, learning to play a new sport. Maybe they need to learn to be a little kind to themselves and reinforce their efforts. Those could all be antecedent things that you could work on. In terms of consequence strategies, I've talked about this before, but it's really important to reinforce effort, to reinforce attempts at the task. Using effective or preferred rewards may help increase that persistence, and increasing the frequency of reinforcement for engagement in the task may help to enhance their persistence. So I think I'm not going to talk through the last four. I've provided you, and we're just going to screen through these now. In each case, we've provided you with antecedent strategies and consequence strategies that I think you might find are helpful. So here for each of those, we're going through those. And there are just some references there that you may find helpful. And lastly, I wanted to say a very big thank you, first and foremost, to all the children and families that I've had the privilege of working with over many years, working with children and families with dealing with ADHD, to my colleagues throughout the world and members of our own research team who have been responsible for the research behind many of the things I've talked about today. Obviously to the ADDitude magazine for this opportunity to reach out and share ideas with you. And of course, to you, the listeners, for being interested and coming along to the webinar now or remotely, and for those of you who have questions. So I just wanted to say thank you very, very much for this opportunity. So Carol, I guess I'm back over to you, or do you want me to just...
Yeah. So first, I just want to thank you, Dr. Tripp, for that great information and guidance. We've received lots of terrific questions. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to thank Equizim Pro once more for sponsoring this webinar. And now I'll get right to the questions. Do you have suggestions for young adults who haven't gotten positive reinforcement in school? They were only told they were lazy, these children. And is it possible to make up for all of the years that they were given this negative reinforcement in school?
Well, I don't know that I can say how much it will make up for them, but I think it's incredibly important that we try. You know, I never think, I'm a clinical psychologist, I never think it is too late to change behavior. But I think in a situation like this, it will be important to help the young person to understand, you know, their feelings, to help them perhaps understand what a functional analysis is, so that they can work to identify what the behaviours are in themselves that they want to change. And that behaviour might be low self-esteem. That might be the thing that needs to be worked on. So I think it is very important. I think it's very important for young people with ADHD to identify things that they are good at, and to have the adults in their environment help them set them up to succeed at those things, and also to provide the additional emotional support that they're going to need, because these are often the young people who give up or maybe engage in behaviours that lead to immediate positive reinforcement because they're not getting positive reinforcement for other aspects in their lives. I think it saddens me greatly when young people haven't had an opportunity for success, which is really why we're pushing this, reinforce every opportunity. Every opportunity you can to acknowledge and support and reward a young person's effort to change. So I don't think it's too late, but I do think it is going to be important that this young person has kind of wraparound support, not just for their, you know, maybe future schooling, but also for actually dealing with probably some very negative feelings about anything involving academics.
Another mom asks, how do you keep a child interested in rewards? I've tried rewards many times, but after a few weeks, my child loses interest and doesn't continue to work for them.
Yeah, that is a very common experience that parents of children with ADHD have. It's one of the reasons why we really strongly encourage praise and social rewards, because those do tend to remain valuable. The other thing to think about too is how hard is the child having to actually work for the rewards? Because we know that children struggle with delay. And again, that's why we go with the positive reinforcers. But yes, children with ADHD, generally, this is something that parents report, is that sometimes you have to change up what it is that's reinforcing. This might also be an opportunity to use something like that PREMAC principle that I talked about, where you actually use as a reward a preferred activity. So rather than you having to come in with some external reward, what are the things that your child really enjoys doing? And can you use those things that they really enjoy as the reinforcer? But I know it's not easy. And I think probably all of the things that we've talked about this morning are things to be thinking about. And I would also look, going back to the functional analysis that we talked about, what else is happening that might explain why those reinforcers lose their value for your child. But I would strongly encourage the use of social reinforcers, also talking with your child about what they find to be reinforcing, but think about what activities you could use as reinforcers.
Someone asked, what are some rewards that should be avoided? She asked about screen time, certain foods.
Okay. I mean, we know that a healthy diet is really important for all of us, but we also know it's very important for children with ADHD to be trying to maximize all areas of their functioning. So screen time, I think the issue with screen time is the amount of time and what it is that children are doing on their screens. So it's a personal choice for parents. I mean, I don't think we should be encouraging our children to be using screens all the time. But if it is something that is highly reinforcing to your child, maybe it is something that's only available, it could be a highly salient reinforcer that you utilize for when you're asking your child to do things that are difficult for them, or to, sustain their attention for a period of time, or if you're asking them to wait. Maybe a little bit of screen time is not a bad thing, as long as it's not something that becomes excessive. Or maybe screen time is something that is only used for, one particular behavior that you particularly want them to engage in, and maybe that is effortful for them. In terms of foods, this is again why we strongly encourage the use of social reinforcers rather than food reinforcers. So maybe if somebody has been put in a great effort, maybe they get to have their favorite healthy food. Or maybe, I really, there are certain foods that I really like and I would probably work for, but they're healthy foods. So if you're going to use a food reward, maybe it's that there's a special meal after some particular achievement, rather than using sweets as a reward. And if you're using sweets as a reward, maybe it would be better to use, no, I'm not saying that you are, but if that was what you were thinking, that's where social rewards like time with a parent, playing a game with a parent that they really enjoy, getting outside, tossing a ball around, those might be reinforcers that you could use that would be highly reinforcing, but don't involve screen time and don't involve food reward.
Okay. A very frustrated mom says, how do you deal with a child who shows defiance for everything you ask him or her to do? I end up yelling and threatening and ultimately allowing them to watch TV endlessly because I'm so at my wit's end.
And I think actually this is a mum who recognises that actually allowing them the outcome that they want is actually not deliberate, but you're not deliberately doing that. But all of the times that you stand firm and then step aside and allow them that activity, that is actually reinforcing them to keep nagging you and to be oppositional. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I was a teenager, I would ask my mother if I could do something, and she quite reasonably would possibly say no. It would usually about going out in the evenings or something. And I'd nag at her until she said, ask your father, which was the very thing I wanted her to say, because I knew he would be more likely to let me do it. So I actively would, nag my mother until the point she got frustrated and said, ask your father, which was precisely what I wanted her to do. So I would actually, in this situation, and I'm not minimizing it by using that example, I'm just saying that when we do keep working towards getting what we want, and this is perhaps what your child has learned and is doing. So this is probably going to take time, but actually going back and beginning to provide reinforcement for the behaviors that you want to see, rather than trying to stop the behaviors that you don't want to see. And again, I think this is where a functional analysis, and I would actually, if you have the opportunity, recommend working with a psychologist or health provider who can support you through making these changes with your child, because it is very frustrating. It is not rewarding for you. And in fact, when you finally get to the point where you say, okay, you can watch TV, that is actually negatively reinforcing for you, because it takes away your child's nagging at you. So I think there are many things to unpack here. And I think going back and thinking about what are the behaviors you want to increase, what are the behaviors you want to decrease, not trying to fix it all at once and not trying to do it all on your own, because this is a really difficult situation. I empathize with you on this situation. And I think it is something that can be improved, but it is going to take work and it is going to take time. And I think it is something where it would be really good if you could partner with somebody to help you actually come up with a plan. And once that plan is in place, your child is going to engage in an extra amount of that inappropriate behavior, because they've learned that sometimes they have to keep increasing their negative behavior in order to get what they want. So you are going to get what we would call an extinction burst. So I don't think I can give you an answer just straight off the bat. But I think it would be very helpful if you could work with a teacher or health provider or a psychologist or somebody who is skilled in teaching behavioural parent training to actually help you unpack and begin the process of working on the behaviours that need to be changed.
Someone asked, do you have suggestions for reinforcement for a child who rejects compliments, verbal appreciation, praises of effort, etc.?
I think what would be very important to look at there is why they are rejecting the social reinforcers. Because almost all of us will actually work for acknowledgement, and maybe to think about whether there are other ways that you can acknowledge their behaviour and show that show that you appreciate it. I don't know what the relationship between the adult and the child are in this case, but if it's if it's a relationship where you can actually ask them, what do you find, what do you enjoy? What are the things that you find pleasant? What are the things that you would like more opportunity to do? And see if there are other reinforcers that might be reinforcing for them, but also to think about why it is that they are, pushing away the praise. Is it because they want more praise, or is it because they're not feeling good about themselves, or they don't like receiving the praise in a public place? So it might be the situation that they are receiving it in that they feel uncomfortable about. There might be other things happening for them, and this is really where the monitoring and the functional analysis, I think, becomes very important for parents.
Well, I'm afraid that was the last question because we're just about out of time. So I'd like to thank you, Dr. Tripp, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with our ADHD community. Next week, our free webinar is titled The Right Questions to Ask Before, During, and After an ADHD Diagnosis with Dr. Noreen Russell. We hope you can join us. Make sure you don't miss future ADDitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at attitudemag.com/newsletters. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Tripp.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the audience.